atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. Today I am surrounded. On my left, I have Ken Katkin, professor of law at Chase Law School, and to my right, I have Oklahoma Christian University professor Trey Orndorff. Ken and Trey, it's so great to be doing the show with you guys today. I'm not used to being the middle guy, but I will do my best in this role. Like I said, looking forward to it. We do have an awful lot to cover, and I'm glad that I have not one but two co-hosts to join me today. But before we do get started with that, I want to thank a new supporter. Well, not really a new supporter. Mickey, who's been a supporter for a while, recently became a yearly supporter, which not only helps, not only helps us out, but it saves 10% over that month-to-month support. So a wise fiscal move for Mickey as well. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And one more thing before you get going. If you are a Democrat and you're concerned about how deep the bench is for our party, it's something we've talked about in the show beforehand, you should check out the An Honorable Profession podcast. Every week they talk to sort of rising star types in the party about what they're doing, how they're working to strengthen our democracy, really at every level from the grassroots, local level on up. And you can find them by either searching your podcast app, and I'll also put a link in today's show notes. And I should also mention on our latest episode of Sustainable Planet, my spouse and fellow political scientist, Kimberly Weir, and I, we had a little bit of a disagreement about climate anxiety. We don't really see eye to eye on it. I'm much more of a techno-optimist than she is. She's definitely more of an idealist than I am. So a little bit of friction here and there. I think it made for a good conversation. I'll put a link to that in the show notes too, as well as to Kimberly's most excellent and completely free Substack about sustainability. So there you go. All right. Well, guys, it has been a long month for President Biden and his inner circle. Of course, the wheels started to come off just under a month ago with his debate performance. And then following a number of unsuccessful efforts to shore up support within the party, and after steadily increasing pressure from top officials and fundraisers, Biden finally called it a day and ended his bid for re-election this last week. And in his address to the nation explaining his decision, Biden said that he was putting the country before himself in order to unify his party. And while he didn't mention Donald Trump by name, he did say that democracy itself was at stake in the upcoming election. And although it took Biden nearly a month to leave the race, it was barely a day before the party coalesced behind Biden's vice president, Kamala Harris. And Biden immediately endorsed her. And then shortly after there, she was endorsed by, well, pretty much everyone, including every more or less viable alternative to her as the Democratic nominee. And this also led to a big surge in Democratic enthusiasm and Democratic donations since Biden, in fact, first announced he wouldn't be seeking re-election through a social media post on Sunday. The Harris campaign raised something like $126 million from 1.4 million donors, as well as adding around 74,000 volunteers. That's an awful lot. And so before we get into Harris as the nominee, I'll start with you, Ken. What do you think about the campaign within the Democratic Party, our side, our guys, the good guys, too, that led to Biden's withdrawal?
Well, you know, it's a complex answer to that now because I opposed it. I definitely thought, you know, at the beginning of all that, it would have been better to stick with Biden, you know, no matter how poorly he did in the debate and no matter how poorly he seemed to be doing in the week after the debate, because, you know, for one thing, you know, all of the cognitive impairment that he may have displayed is like a drop in the bucket compared to his opponent's cognitive impairment. But yet the you know, Republicans were just completely rallying around Trump. It seemed to me it would have been wiser path for the Democrats to just rally around Biden because there really was no reason that any Democrat should change their vote and vote for Trump, you know, just based on that debate or whatever. But I will say that the more the drumbeat continued forward, I had to accept that at a certain point, people were listening to that drumbeat and Biden was losing support, I think more because of the drumbeat to get rid of him from Dems than because of the debate performance itself. But it came to a point where his candidacy was untenable and he had to step down. So I don't disagree in the end with his decision to step down. I disagree in the beginning with the drumbeat of Dems asking him to step down.
Trey, what about you? You're much more of, I would say, a Republican-leaning voter on a lot of things, certainly an anti-Trump person. But what's your take on Biden's decision to finally step down or step aside?
Had he done that earlier, had he at the beginning said, I'm a one-term president, I'm moving forward, and Harris is my pick, I think he goes down in history as a much better president than he ends up going down now as a result of this. And this is something, Ken, you and I had talked about a little bit. I disagree with you fundamentally that Trump has, as you put it, cognitive problems. I just deeply, deeply disagree with him. I think he's wrong. I think it's bad. But I think that's different than the kind of cognitive decline that we saw happening with Biden. And I think part of the reason Biden made it as far as he did, and I understand that in the context of family and the position that it is, but you didn't have to be on my side of the aisle to recognize that the president was suffering a kind of cognitive decline that was different from the problems exhibited by Trump. They weren't equivalent. And so as a result, he has to step aside. He does at least step aside now, but it leaves you in a really weird position. I mean, obviously there are some positive signs. Mike, you were talking about that. I think the biggest one quantitatively, we think about it, is the amount of new donations and small money donations that come in to the Harris campaign. But it's even as a guy who specializes in presidential politics, this is a unique circumstance. It's difficult to make predictions as it goes along. But no, Biden should have dropped out as a one-term president, and he would have gone down in history as a much better president.
Yeah, I wish that he would have reached that decision earlier, but I understand why it didn't happen that way. I think it's, a lot of people are talking about how Biden, it just was this stubborn old coot who couldn't realize his demise and was surrounded by a bunch of yes people and so forth. And I'm not saying there's not some element of that to almost anyone who attains the sort of power and position that he does. But I think it's much more of a story of humans oftentimes just generally having a difficult time knowing when to call it quits. And I guess I'm somewhere between you and Ken on this. I think that Biden isn't necessarily in clear cognitive decline right now. It may be the case, but I do have enough concerns to say, well, if there's a viable alternative to him on my side of the aisle, I would rather have that person be in office for the next 4 years than Joe Biden be in office, because right now he looks shaky at best. And I would not shudder to think, but I'm not crazy about the idea of having an octogenarian in any case in the White House, given how demanding the job is. I think Kamala Harris will do a fine job if she gets elected. And so I think it was the right move, though I wish it would have happened a little bit sooner. Now, there are, I guess, Trey, on the point you make about Trump and cognitive issues, I would agree with you that I don't necessarily see as much cognitive decline as I do, I guess what I would call maybe narcissistic personality disorder or something like that.
Absolutely, yes.
But
yes.
yeah, I don't think that's great either, I mean, so, but in any case, so I do want to talk about a couple of arguments, a couple of points that I've been hearing from the right about this. And one of these is that this is Biden withdrawing is some sort of anti-democratic coup is the word that's being used. Essentially, Biden was pushed out against his will and the voters are being ignored. And these hypocritical Democrats who say they care so much about saving democracy, yet they're happy to throw it out the window when it comes to the people, the person that their voters chose as the nominee. Ken, what do you think about that? I'm sure you've heard that argument too.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a typical Republican propaganda thing that does have a kernel of truth to it, but ultimately is false and misleading. I think to me, one of the reasons that I was thinking that Biden, if he could have, should have stayed in, was because he was the one who won all the primaries. And I agree that that's an important thing, right? So I don't think that's false at all. I think that, that we had a primary if people thought he was too old to get renominated, they should have taken him on in the primary, and they didn't. And one guy did, but got no votes basically. And I think that's serious. But on the other hand, I think the misleading and false part of that argument is that there is no coup, because it's Biden himself that made the decision. And Harris is the person that the voters actually voted for on the 2020 ballot, and certainly thought, although she wasn't formally on the 2024 primary ballot, certainly, the understanding on which people voted for Biden in the 2024 primary was that Harris was still going to be the vice president. And so the voters did, endorse Harris at several junctures as being the person who would step in if Biden couldn't continue to do the job. And it was Biden himself who decided that he couldn't continue to do the job. So that seems to me to be perfectly democratic.
Well, I guess I would disagree on one point. I don't think that Biden decided that he couldn't continue to do the job. I think in his heart of hearts, Biden feels like he is the best person to do the job and the only one who can really do the job to the level that he can, but that circumstances pushed him out of the job.
Yeah, I actually agree with your recharacterization. What I meant to say was couldn't continue to be the candidate.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Another thing I've heard from Republicans is that Thomas Massey and many others have said this to this point. Well, if Joe Biden isn't fit to run, how is he fit to be president? Now, Trey, you mentioned the cognitive decline thing. And so I was wondering what you think about that argument from the right, that, hey, if he's going to not run, then he should just step down as president right now.
Because we don't know precisely the level. I mean, it is apparent that he has some kinds of impairment and age approaching. But where is that precisely? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not in the position to make that call. And so I understand the usefulness rhetorically of making that argument, but I think it is a little bit pointless pragmatically to put all of to try to put that as being a primary thing that he has to now step aside from the presidency. I think primarily the reason that's a positive thing in terms of the value of a campaign is because you want Harris to have to run as being part of she is the administration, as opposed to getting to run away from the last 4 years. Because that's what Republicans have been successfully, whether you like it or not, have been successfully running against, has been the status quo of Biden. That is not a popular position. And Vice President Harris, to the extent she can, is going to want to attempt to separate. But I think those kinds of calls, and I saw the one from Massey, it's a way of trying to force Kamala to say, look, you are involved in it right now. You are kind of de facto president, aren't you? Ergo, you're responsible for the things that you had happen while you were VP. That's my takeaway from that.
My take is on this whole thing is that Kamala Harris is the worst nominee who isn't Joe Biden. And I get why she was chosen, because it is the simplest path. It was the easiest way to unite the party. She does have, I think, the most legitimacy for the reasons that Ken mentioned. But
she also has access to the money. She has access to the money.
The easiest access to the money. I think there would have been ways to get the Biden money to anyone else, but it would have been a lot more complicated. There could have been legal challenges. But that said, I think she was the easiest choice, but not necessarily the best choice. You already, Trey, mentioned that she's tied to the administration. There are already talks about how she's the immigration czar, which of course is not even a thing, but that's the label they're trying to make stick. She's significantly, based on at least Senate records, she's significantly more liberal than Biden. I mean, I pulled up her Senate voting records, and she was roughly more liberal than around 97% of Senate Democrats for the time she was in. You compare that to Biden's always been kind of trying to find the middle of the road for his party for the time he's been in. So she wouldn't have been my first, second, or third choice as a candidate. I think she is a very weak candidate, but slightly less weak than Joe Biden for those reasons. Ken, what do you think?
Yeah, I think she's the only one who could have been the candidate, because there was no time for any kind of legitimate process to find anyone else. And she was the one that had been elected, as I mentioned, both in 20 on the general election and in 24 on the primary election, as being the heir apparent. So I think any other process would have been divisive and illegitimate, and would have, left people who supported the various different candidates feeling like their candidate got screwed by an illegitimate process. And I think that was not a road to go down. Maintaining it or trying to revive party unity is the only path to victory, and I think she was the only vehicle to do it. I did want to say on the issue that Trey addressed about the 25th Amendment or about Biden lacking enough cognitive well-being to go forward. Biden, has been an extremely effective president. Now, I know, there's been some disagreement with some of his policies within the Democratic coalition, particularly with respect to Israel and Gaza. But in terms of his ability in a very, very difficult political environment and in a very, very difficult congressional environment to, formulate policies and implement those policies and do really big things, I think he's the most successful president since FDR, the most effective president since FDR. And I think, people who are going to judge him more by like what they see in a televised debate with Trump, where Trump is, screaming at him the whole time, blowing his concentration, although Trump's mic was off, versus looking at the way he's actually performed his job for 3.5 years is the wrong metric. And I see no reason to think he's not firing 100% on all cylinders with respect to how he's actually doing his job, because there's no examples in his job performance of him, screwing anything up for any kind of cognitive reasons.
Well, I certainly agree that Biden has done, in my view, some pretty good things. I would definitely not agree that he's been the best president since FDR. I'd say he's been the best president since Obama. I think that the Affordable Care Act was just enormous. And so that puts Obama, I think just that alone puts him well ahead of Biden, in my view. And I would make arguments probably for some Republican presidents ahead of him. I know, Ken, you wouldn't go there, but so I think that's a valid point. I guess I feel also that one of the reasons why the party was able to coalesce so quickly is that I don't have access to this information, but I would expect that both Shapiro and Whitmer, who I would have liked more as candidates, both felt it was probably wise not to challenge Harris. Number one, for not having that bad blood, especially given the Democratic coalition pushing back, challenging someone who could be the first female president, that, and a woman of color, that would not necessarily be a good look within the party. But also, when Harris loses, and I think she's more likely than not to lose, then one of those two, I think, is going to be in a much better position in 2028 than they would be sort of in this year to be the Democratic nominee and actually be successful in an election. So I think there might have been a little of that strategizing as well, because they were both very quick to jump on the Harris bandwagon. I don't know what either of you guys think about that, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, why would you want to come into an election where you're fighting an uphill battle when you look at the empirical results to this juncture? What's the advantage to that? And to be the VP, and then at that juncture to then have subordinated yourself in a way that doesn't allow you to set up for a run down the line. Again, I think it's difficult to make a big prediction, but if we're assuming, I think we have to start with, that Vice President Harris is going to inherit the structural nature of the race that we kind of look at as political scientists, there doesn't seem to be a big reason to want to take that year on.
Yeah. And, go ahead.
I would just add, Harris, of course, is going to win the general election, but if she doesn't,
definitively though, Ken,
because I think it's craziness to think of it. It could go any other way. The polls have already completely evened up, and all the momentum is in Harris's direction. And Trump.
That's just horse race narrative. I mean, I get you, and I understand that you want
the underlying
win. Yeah. I'm going to vote. I'm going to vote for Harris. I'm not going to. I mean, granted. I mean, I was not going to vote for Biden. I'm definitely going to vote for Harris. There you go. You've heard it here first. But to suggest again, we know that the factors that go into determining the large structural factors are not in the favor of the incumbent. So it seems really unusual for you to say, well, it's got to be Harris, other than just kind of like partisanship.
No, all the factors are in her favor. They got 81.3 million votes just 4 years ago. Almost everybody who voted for Biden 4 years ago is satisfied with the job the Biden administration has done. He was losing some support because of these issues about his age, but that's going to go away. And she's already appealing much more to younger voters and She kind of can get a blank slate on the Palestine and Gaza issue, which I think is important. So I think all the fundamentals are actually in her favor. If you look at the economics, like this is the best economy, one of the best economies we've had. When an incumbent has a good economy,
but the metric that matters is the feeling of the economy, and the feeling of the economy is highly underwater for the current administration.
Let's pull back, guys. Now, Ken, I hope that you're absolutely right. I will give you half a dozen victory laps if you're right, and I will do a whole mea culpa episode. But the fact of the matter is that those national numbers don't mean diddly. What matters? This race is going to boil down to a tiny number of undecided voters in not 7, but more likely 3 states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. We're probably talking around the voters who are really going to matter in this election. By my calculations, less than 0.2% of the likely electorate. Those are the people who matter. Those are the people who are going to be very tightly contested. And you can take those national polls and you can just, well, they're not printed on paper anymore. But if they were, you could just throw them right in the shredder because that's what they mean. I agree with you, Ken, that Harris has some momentum now, and that's a good thing. But I think anyone who says they know for sure that this is in the bag for either side right now until we've had more than a few decent polls from those 3 states just is whatever they're smoking. Maybe I should smoke some of it too. I don't know, but that's kind of where we're at right now, I think.
Can I also address your other thing about Whitmer and Shapiro?
Please do.
Yeah. So I think, Whitmer in essence, I think isn't really in the running for VP, but I think Shapiro is. And I don't think they'll go with 2 women. And that's one of the main reasons I think Whitmer's not in it. But I think Shapiro, very much would like to be part of this ticket. I don't know that he's going to get it. And I know we're going to talk about that later. But certainly, no white candidate, and especially no white male candidate, was going to try to shove aside the first African-American female who's already the sitting vice president. So I think that did, very much grease the wheels for Harris to be pretty uncontested. But I also think that all the candidates you mentioned are young enough that actually they'll do fine whether she wins or loses, because, if she loses, then they're lining up to run in 28. But if she wins, then, one of them is going to actually be her VP, and they're all lining up to run in 32. So, and that 32 is not so far away for people like Shapiro or Whitmer.
Let's move into a discussion of the whole VP stakes. Yeah, I think that's a term. I don't know. Anyway, but because I wanted to talk about that point you raised. I took a look at, when you think about the VP as being sort of a launching ground to the presidency, that's true, but it's only really true if you're on a winning ticket. If you're just nominated, for instance, in the last century, which we're talking about 26 presidential elections, only one vice president, a running mate on a losing ticket, has gone on to become president. I don't know if either of you guys know who that is. Quick quiz.
Ooh, that's a good quiz. I don't know.
Well, it could be FDR.
There you go. Well, yep, FDR was James Cox's running mate in 1920. They lost to Harding and Coolidge.
Yep, but so I got it right.
There you go. But aside from that, and if you look at the other side of it, I believe there were 6 actual vice presidents in that same period who went on to become president. So, but yeah, when we look at the vice presidential race, I think you're right. I don't know that Whitmer is likely to be on the ticket. So that leaves us with probably a bunch of governors, right? We have Pennsylvania, we have Shapiro, we've got Andy Beshear from Kentucky, Roy Cooper in North Carolina, Illinois, we got Pritzker there, and then Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. I think those are the main candidates. Of those, I would say Cooper and Beshear are interesting to me because I don't think either of them are going to be president, simply because, number one, Cooper is likely too old. I mean, he's 67 now. He'd be 75 in 2032, which presumably after 2 terms of a Harris presidency. I also think he'd be too moderate to win in a Democratic primary. And Beshear's a lot younger, but I think he's also too moderate to get through to a Democratic primary without having been VP. That's my take on those 2 guys. What do you guys think about them?
I think Beshear is the one she ends up picking. If I was picking, I'd pick him. And I'd pick him primarily because he isn't a threat. And if you take a look at the polling, because vice presidents, they're not going to help you. They don't get you elected. What they can do is they can just at least not hurt you. he has the best of the unfavorability ratings. When you take a look at all of the viable candidates, he's sitting at around, just a 13% unfavorability rating. Other people have a much higher rating, including Cooper in most polls. It's relatively close, but in most polls, Bashir's just got a little bit better on that unfavorability side. I don't think it matters so much your favorability; it matters your unfavorability. So if I was just going to reach out and pick, I'd pick Bashir just because he's unintrusive, And so the thing that's going to keep him from being president, I don't disagree with you on that front, Mike, but I think it's what makes him a pretty effective VP because he's not going to be Vance.
Yeah. Ken, what do you think?
Well, I think I like Cooper the best. Partly it's parochial reason. I'm an employee of the state government of Kentucky, and I hope they don't take Andy Bashir out of Kentucky. I lived in Kentucky and worked as a state government employee under Governor Bevin, and everything was a million times worse personally for me than working under either Governor Bashir or his father. So that's why I don't want him to go. But I basically agree with the praise that Trey had for him. I really do like Cooper. I don't like Kelly as much, even though I think Kelly would be fine from a national electoral standpoint. But I don't like the idea of taking him out of the Senate. Even though there wouldn't be a special election until 26, he could otherwise sit in his elected term until 28. And I think it would be, a very, very harsh side effect of this presidential run, that in order to win the presidency, we have to put control of the Senate into serious jeopardy. And I think it's already in jeopardy, but I think that would be just another nail in the coffin of maintaining a majority in the Senate. So I would not like to do that for that reason.
Absolutely true. I mean, if you're a Democrat, you don't want to you've already got uphill battles going on. Why do you want to make it harder? Absolutely.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. So I'm against Kelly only for that reason. And of all the governors, I think, there's nothing wrong with Shapiro. And I do think he might, help cement Pennsylvania better. But I think, I think Cooper actually brings North Carolina back into play. And if North Carolina comes into play, then states like Georgia certainly come into play. So I think Cooper provides actually a lot of advantages there.
I definitely need to hang out more with you, Ken, and suck up some of that optimism, because when I look at the map, I think that if Democrats somehow manage to win this, it's going to be with exactly 270 electoral votes, and I don't see a map that gets them any more than that. I think Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, all of those states are just completely out of play. But I hope you're right about that. I would love to see a 300 plus electoral vote win for the Democrats, but wow, I just don't imagine it. Trey, what do you think? Are you more kind of like along my lines on this, or do you think that Ken maybe has a point there?
Yeah, you mean about them being able to put that state into play?
Yeah.
No. No, I mean, Ken, I love you, and we do these shows together, and it's sad when I'm not on them for a while, but I think this is one of those areas where you have a little bit of a bias. You're such a supporter, and you want to see that to win, and you see it through that lens. And so, and then this is the case. I mean, again, I've already started at the outset by saying, I'm going to vote for Harris, but at the same time, I can take a look at those structural factors as a scientist and say, as Mike is doing, I don't see there being some overwhelming move towards Democrats. It's a close race, but I think it's a close race that favors Trump at this juncture when you look at just the empirics of it. And so, no, and the other thing to keep in mind here is I don't think there's a universe in which we have ever noticed a vice president changing radically the state voting patterns. So again, I don't think you're picking a vice president to change any particular state's votes. Nobody votes on the downside of a ticket. You're just trying to have a strong ticket as an overall and not have any negatives. And I do think that was one of the problems with the picking Vance, but that's a different story. That's a different question.
I find myself in between both of you on this a little bit again. So I think that's probably true for Arizona, which I think is out of reach. But I think Pennsylvania is a must win. I think it's going to be close enough, too, where even though people don't vote for vice presidents, I think it's possible if, say, Shapiro's on the ticket, that maybe that might mean 5,000 votes go to him that go to Harris, a Harris Shapiro ticket that wouldn't have gone to a Harris somebody else ticket. And so I could see that mattering on the margins if it's super close, which is why I think maybe that matters in Pennsylvania's case, but probably not for Kelly in Arizona. So one thing we haven't talked about yet, really a whole lot, is what Kamala Harris presidency might look like. And, typically presidential campaigns develop over the course of not months, but years. And so one of the many areas where Vice President Harris is going to have to play catch up is in developing and putting out there a policy agenda. And as I mentioned previously, she's seen as generally more liberal than Biden, but we don't really have a lot of detailed policies to look at. That's certainly something we'll be doing in the months to come. Some things we do know. She's a strong defender of abortion rights, though I would argue that doesn't necessarily separate her a ton from Biden, but maybe a little bit. Also, Ken mentioned the economy. Harris would inherit an economy in which inflation isn't likely to be the drag on her that it had been for most of Biden's term. I mean, the economy looks really strong at this point, especially compared to the economies of sort of other big, rich countries. I think I would expect that she would push for a lot of what Biden did, but go even bigger. When we take a look at her time in the Senate, for instance, one of her biggest initiatives was and this was in her 2020 presidential run as well, the Lift the Middle Class Act, which was sort of a kind of a means-tested basic income thing, up to $6,000 a year to couples, costs between $2 to $3 trillion over a decade. So I would say if you like big government under Joe Biden, you'll love big government under Kamala Harris. But that said, I think she's unlikely to accomplish as much as Biden because you take a look at how the congressional map plays out, and I think that is a good chance Democrats won't control both chambers as they did, even if it's by a slim margin in the first 2 years of Biden's term, which is where he got all of his big stuff done then. So that's my take on what I would expect to see from Kamala Harris policy-wise. Again, we're going to see a lot more as she rolls out these things. But Ken, what do you think a Harris administration would look like in terms of maybe how it might differ from a Biden administration?
Yeah, I agree with your analysis there. I don't think she's going to make any. I don't think she's going to succeed in making any big changes from what Biden was up to. I think she'll largely embrace the Biden agenda in its entirety anyhow. But I think to the extent that she would like to make a few changes, for instance, Biden wanted to partially repeal the Trump tax cuts, and Harris has said she wants to completely repeal the Trump tax cuts. I don't actually think that's going to be easy to do just in Congress. And I think most of the places where you could find differences between what Harris is saying and what Biden was saying are not going to be easy to accomplish. I actually think that's also true on Israel and Gaza, where I think she has been talking as if she wants to, put much more emphasis on a peace settlement than on an Israeli victory than even Biden did, although Biden also has been putting emphasis on a peace settlement. But I think because of American national security imperatives, that's actually going to be hard to do, to make that shift also. So I basically think what we're going to see is largely a continuation of Biden policies in practice, but maybe some different emphases rhetorically.
Yeah. And Trey, it occurs to me that you're screwed either way, no matter who wins, because if Harris wins, we're going to see, probably a huge amount, however much spending she can push through. And if Trump wins, we're going to see the tax cuts renewed and maybe even more. And so as a kind of a smaller government libertarian guy, you just really don't have any place to go, do you?
Listen, I'm just laying in the corner. Just hoping that we can pick somebody better in the future.
You're curled up in the fetal position here going, oh my God, make it stop. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I will say the one area that I think that you might have both overlooked that I think might be a little bit unique is, and Mike, you said this early on, you said, I don't think she's going to be a lot different when it comes to abortion rights and access. I do. I mean, if you think back to when Nancy Pelosi first became the dominant player and took over the House, there were a ton of changes that occurred in the makeup of the House. Probably things that I think average listeners probably didn't even realize, like the ability for women to have spaces to nurse and just lots of little things that unless you're paying careful attention. And I think that difference, I think that's going to be an area that Harris will feel differently about because of who she is. And I think that's going to play a bigger role in her presidency then it probably wouldn't Biden. Not because Biden disagreed, but I think this is just one of those areas where who you are changes the tone and the priority for some of those issues. And so I actually think abortion access is going to be a bigger deal if Harris, as part of her priority than we saw from Biden. Again, not because I think Biden didn't agree, but just because of the nature of who they are.
I agree absolutely that rhetorically that's going to be a much more major issue in her campaign and maybe in her administration if she gets elected. That's actually the prime issue I had in mind when I was saying she may not be able to make any kind of changes like that. I mean, in order to pass a Roe v. Wade bill, which she would certainly support and push for, national Roe v. Wade bill, the Dems are going to have to not only get majorities in the House and the Senate, but they're going to have to get enough Dems into the Senate that they're going to be willing to jettison the filibuster rule to do that. And I just don't see that happening.
Well, I was going to say there is sort of a.
I think you have a tough row, but I mean, again, if we're just trying to decide I think there are some issues on which presidents and presidential candidates expend their capital, whether or not they think they're necessarily going to win.
Well, I think. I think there is a scenario, Ken, that's maybe even too optimistic for you. So I hesitate to mention it, but you could see a scenario where this enthusiasm for Harris doesn't diminish, and Donald Trump, who has a remarkable talent for saying things to alienate persuadable voters, I think, and who knows what J.D. Vance is going to do, that there's not a crazy scenario that says, well, we end up with 51 Democrats in the Senate and the small majority in the House, and maybe they're able to end the filibuster there with some good party unity and pass the For the People Act that's been around for a while now, that whole raft of electoral reforms, that sort of thing. And that's like sort of my ideal. I don't know that that's going to happen. If it's too optimistic for you, Ken, it's probably not plausible, but it's not insane, I don't think.
Well, I think when the filibuster rule gets eliminated, it's going to be when we have a Republican Senate. I don't think the Democratic Senate is going to eliminate the filibuster rule.
And have in the past for different things.
Say it again.
Democrats have in the past.
Oh, you mean for nominations? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was only for the circuit court judicial nominations, I guess, and that was in response to a really, really unprecedented obstruction from the Republicans then. I don't think the Dems have ever made any other changes to the filibuster rule except for the circuit court judicial nominations. But correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, but I think this would be the time for them to do it, because I think there's an argument to be made that if you believe that Republicans at the state and local level are sort of systematically doing things to, in effect, disenfranchise voters and try to lock in their majorities, a huge package of reforms like we saw in the For the People Act, which deals with an awful lot of stuff, that could actually make the results of elections maybe more in line with the will of the people writ large, which at this point happens to favor Democrats, I think, more than Republicans. That might be a big enough of a victory to be worth actually ending the filibuster for. I would argue that if Democrats were going to end the filibuster for anything, it would be for that. What do you think, Ken?
Well, I would support it. I'll say that. I agree with your analysis of what's the right thing to do. I don't actually agree with your prediction that could easily happen, because I think the problem has been that, you always have a few Democratic senators who've been elected from, otherwise Republican states. Like Manchin would be the poster boy for that now. Manchin will be the poster boy for that now. Sinema thought of herself that way, although I think her state's electorate changed on her a little bit. But as long as you have some Democratic senators who are elected from mostly Republican states, it's a political liability for them, for the Senate to be really able to implement a much more liberal agenda. And for that reason, I think those kind of senators have tended not to go along with changing the filibuster rule. And so that's why I think you would need a much larger majority to get it done. I think you'd need at least 55 Dems in there before you could find 51 who would agree to change the filibuster rule. Yeah,
I think you're probably right. At least I would say a bare minimum 53, and that's certainly not in the cards in this cycle. So, but I did want to throw that out there. Trey, what are your any other thoughts on what you would expect, good, bad, or indifferent from a Harris administration?
I mean, I think the other item that Harris is going to have to move on if her goal is to be, continue that is she has to decide what's going to be happening on the border. And this is not one. I mean, again, I am not the mainstream voter on this at all, but I can understand the data enough to recognize that across the aisle, that has become a key issue. And Biden, frankly, he was never perceived as having been successful on that issue. And I think that's going to be something that will be at the top of the Harris agenda. And I think in part, and you talked about that earlier, she was kind of tasked with that. That was one of her big items. She's going to go down to the border. She's going to, be that person. And now she's the president. She's going to have to own that. And I think that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing for her, but I think that's going to by default become a primary item of her campaign, or probably not her campaign, but it would have to become at least a primary item of her agenda.
Yeah, it really amazes me how big of an issue the border is. Even like I'm inundated with the ads here in Cincinnati, where it's not like we're very close to the border, but from the ads I've been seeing from the Bernie Moreno campaign and the Friends of Bernie, he's running against Sherrod Brown for the Ohio seat. You would think that there is just a horde of Guatemalans who are just descending upon southern Ohio, just getting ready like locusts to just wipe us all out. It's just, I feel like I'm not nearly afraid enough according to these ads. But I mean, the point is, of course, is that this plays really, really well with a lot of folks. And I think it is an unfair, clearly Harris was given the charge of kind of dealing with the diplomatic aspects of the border. That didn't go very far. Mm-hmm. You need to give the vice president something to do, ideally. But it's not like this idea that she's this border czar and she was a decision maker and a shot caller. Aside from Dick Cheney, I can't think of a single vice president who had any kind of real power in the White House in generations. And certainly it wasn't Kamala Harris. And so while I feel that's an unfair and inaccurate characterization, I feel like it's one that might very well stick. Ken, what do you think about that?
It'll stick if she doesn't forcefully refute it, but I think she has the arguments available to her that can forcefully refute it. I mean, for one thing, there is no solution to the border crisis that doesn't involve the Congress. The Congress has to legislate something, and it's a fact that the Biden administration, negotiated with Republican senators, especially Lankford from Oklahoma, Trey's senator, and agreed upon a border bill that was mostly a Republican bill. And then the Republicans didn't pass it because Trump told them that he wanted to perpetuate the border crisis as much as he could so it could be an election issue for him. And that's all true. And Kamala Harris can explain that to the public, that she wants to work with the Congress to have a bipartisan solution to this problem, like the one that was actually negotiated, and that the only reason we don't have it is because Trump thought it would be an electoral issue for him to perpetuate the crisis, which is really a very unpatriotic and a really immoral thing for Trump to have done. So I think she can turn it that way. She can also point out that, as bad as the problem has been in terms of people's perceptions, border crossings actually are right now, lower now and in 2024 than they were in any of the previous years of the Biden administration. So things are moving in a good direction. So it's not like they haven't done anything on that.
Yeah, I think the sort of the sympathetic or the positive spin on this from the Biden viewpoint, Biden-Harris viewpoint, is that, hey, President Biden negotiated in good faith, wanted this to be a Congress thing and not an executive thing. And then when that just didn't work out after years of trying to work through that, he finally issued an executive order, and we saw crossings arrest just really plummet after that. Now, of course, I would argue that the Republicans spin on that too little, too late. And I guess I'm not as convinced as you are, Ken, of the ability of the persuadability of a lot of voters on this issue. But Trey, I want to hear from you on this. What do you think?
Look, I mean, here's a presidential truth. The reason that the presidency has become more and more powerful over time is because voters consistently demand more and more of the executive to be done in that fashion. And their understanding of the division of power between Congress and the presidency is not uber tenable. And we don't like the negotiative process of Congress, which is why Congress polls in single digits at its approval rating. So I hear what you mean. So, Ken, I do not disagree with you, right? I'm going to be clear. I don't disagree with you. I think Congress needs to be kind of doing these things. But what we're getting at here is the question of how will it impact a race and what, therefore, will have to be the messaging. And on that front, and that's where I disagree with you, is that the American polling public, if they were inclined to say, oh, those are things Congress ought to do, would not have systematically over the last 100-ish years demanded more and more of presidents to be done unilaterally, pushing presidents in that direction. And so I don't think that Vice President Harris has an easy out and is able to say, and rightfully so. I mean, Langford got hung out to dry by Trump. It was interesting talking with some of his people. But you know, again, he's not going to, he didn't get off the hook. You know, he got lambasted here in Oklahoma from something that people loved to hated overnight. And likewise, there is no easy explanation for him. And likewise, there's no easy explanation for Vice President Harris. So again, I don't disagree with you in the facts. I mean, it is in fact true. Congress should, if that's the goal, pass reform. And that is a congressional duty. But if you look historically over the last 100 years, we have pushed more and more of those items to the presidency precisely because that is what voters want to have happen. And I think this is one of those issues where I don't think there's an easy explanation to voters because you're the president. You're supposed to handle it.
Well, right. I mean, I mostly agree with what you guys are saying about the politics of it, but the one sort of subtle difference I see here is, I don't expect that anything she says on this is going to persuade any presumptive Trump voters. But I think to the extent that we're talking about people who are presumptive Harris voters, and I would say, remember, 81.3 million people, including majorities in all the swing states, did vote for Biden-Harris. So I think people who voted for Biden-Harris are I would still consider to be presumptive Biden voters.
But when you look at polls right now, though, the polls among those on the left give them kind of dismal approval when it comes to the border, right? So take away Republicans for a second and just look at the polling data for those who are presumptive Democratic voters. They rank her and former, soon to be former President Biden very lowly on this issue. And I think it's those are the individuals that she's going to have to win over.
Yeah, right. I agree with that. But they will listen to what she has to say, and she may be able to persuade them. They're not going to close their ears to what she has to say the way Republicans are.
Yeah, I think that's true.
But I guess what I'm suggesting is that voters across the board have not done that. And so given that we see that as a kind of a uniform empirical pattern for presidents, I'm not sure why I would assume in this particular instance, Democratic voters particularistically would depart from those historic trends.
Because she hasn't made that argument yet, and she's got to make it.
And keep in mind, she doesn't need to make this argument to voters as a whole. She basically needs to make this argument to a few 100,000 voters, to tailor it to a few 100,000 voters in 3 states. And that's a very different, maybe that's an easier thing, a harder thing, but it's different than trying to convince the country, which is why, again, when we talk about the state of the race, I mean, I think it's Trump's race to lose, but if I had to put his odds of winning, I'd say maybe like 60% or so, simply because we don't have enough of the polling yet. And I think Ken does make a reasonable point saying that, well, when push comes to shove and it's October, November, and people are actually starting to vote, and they're faced with that choice right in front of them. Well, do I want to vote for Trump or do I want to vote for not Trump? I think it's possible that there might be some breaking toward Harris. And so I don't think Kent's wrong to point that out, but I also think that I need to see a lot more polling and I need to wait a little longer to kind of feel that Harris really is the favorite, because to me right now, she's clearly not. And so in that respect, I agree with you, Trey. Okay. Well, let's move on to something that's, well, not directly related to presidential politics, but everything is really at this point, this time of year. But so the investigations into how the attempt on Donald Trump's life nearly succeeded, they're in their early stages, but there has been one significant development, and that is the resignation of Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheatle. And in her resignation announcement to Secret Service employees, Cheatle wrote that the agency fell short on its mission and that as director, she takes full responsibility. The day before that resignation, she testified before the House Oversight Committee in which, wow, she took a beating from both sides. Both committee chair Republican James Comer and ranking Democrat Jamie Raskin called for her resignation. Democratic committee member Ro Khanna said, I think you need to reflect. You cannot go leading a Secret Service agency when there is an assassination attempt on a presidential candidate. And I think Cheadle attempted to make the case for not rushing to judgment until there could be a thorough investigation, which she said the internal investigation a couple of months. A number of folks said, well, we're not willing to wait for that long, essentially. It got even a little vulgar at times. Nancy Mace, Republican, told Cheadle that she was full of shit, kind of elevating the proceedings, as Nancy Mace often does. You go, Nancy, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, prior to this, Cheadle said she had no intention of resigning, but I would say she clearly, for whatever reason, did not expect the sort of bipartisan beating that she took. And with no political cover, she was essentially forced to resign. So, Ken, what did you think about that hearing and her resignation?
Well, I suppose two things in conflict with each other. The hearing was a complete disgrace, but her resignation, I think, needed to come. So not because of the hearing, but just because of the fact that a shot got off at the ex-president. And I think it was that they should have been able to prevent that. And they didn't, and somebody needed to be held accountable for that. But I don't think any of the Congress members, any of the Republican Congress members in that hearing, as usual, were in even the slightest bit of good faith or even trying to gain an understanding of what actually went wrong.
Trey, what do you think?
The more that I have looked at what happened during that attempt, the more that this is the one and only time where I've said to myself, well, I kind of understand some of the conspiracy theorists out there because it was so terrible. I cannot understand what took place. I mean, of course, you can't stop every crazy person. You can't stop everybody who has an intention to do things. And I get that. But the circumstances of having a building with nobody on it, having it clearly within the bounds of an easily accessible weapon, having somebody, be able to have done this with drones in advance to map it out what they were doing and to have no idea that that's going down. She should have just resigned. I mean, was it political theater when we got to the committee hearing? Of course. But how in the world did she think it was going to be anything less than her head coming up on a plate? Like, it baffled me. I mean,
yeah,
48 hours later, she could have resigned and saved herself and the country that hearing. That's what I have to say about that.
I think I disagree with Ro Khanna saying that, well, if someone gets a shot off at a protectee, that's a massive Secret Service failure because, there can be highly coordinated, very sophisticated attempts to take out someone that the Secret Service is protecting. And especially if the people are willing to die in that attempt, it can be next to impossible. When you look at, the guy was on the roof like 20 minutes before, it was pointed out, all those things. And that's the sort of failure where I guess I was disappointed in Democrats, particularly in President Biden, who I feel like he missed a layup here, saying that I feel like he should have called for her resignation within the first 48 hours. And that would have at least, I think, maybe not bought him some goodwill, but I feel like it was the right thing to do. And, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas saying that he had full confidence in her after that. I thought, what are you people doing? What are you thinking? I mean, this is not the time to circle the wagon. Someone had to be sacrificed for this. And sure, she wasn't on the scene, but that doesn't matter. This was such an enormous operational failure. And then it was a political failure to not boot her right away. That's kind of what
agreed.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree. Because again, like you said, this wasn't some, how could you have stopped it? Wow, what an incredible plan. This was just the basics of what you would assume anyone would do under circumstance, even if you weren't. I mean, it's just the lack of, as you put it, operational awareness is so terrible that it's hard to fathom.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree about the lack of operational awareness and the need for her to step down. The only slight disagreement I'll have with Michael here is I think that Biden did the right thing to wait until not to call for her immediate resignation, because even though, as we learned in the ensuing days, this was a fairly extreme operational failure that warranted a resignation, that was not at all obvious at the earliest moments when the Republicans were already calling for it. And I think the way his knee jerks in favor of not being bullied around by that kind of coordinated propaganda campaign is absolutely right. And, I wouldn't want him to be just, every time the Republicans scream, another member of your administration needs to be fired. I would not want to see him being too quick to listen to that. So I think this
is vastly different than that. I mean, in the first 24 hours, we knew that there is a building that was within the easy functional distance of a weapon that is is easily available in the United States. And there on that building, in that sight line, was a person for a significant amount of time who brought a ladder to get up that inside this, and that was not somehow inside the security loop of this thing. I mean, we knew all of that before 24 hours was up. How much more failure could you need? I mean, of course we've seen more, but that was knowable in the first day.
Yeah, although it was a failure, but also knowable within the first day was that that area there had been discussions between the Secret Service and the Butler County Police. The Butler County Police had taken responsibility for that building. Now, maybe it was wrong of the Secret Service to offload that to them. It was wrong, I think. But I think, all the operational failures, once you had the fact that this was a building within the Butler County part of the plan and not the Secret Service part of the plan, all of the failures were basically by Butler County Police. And I think, just kind of working through how much blame should the Secret Service take for that, I think rightly took a couple days. And so, again, I rightly, I come down on the same side in the end that this was the Secret Service's fault. But I think that was less than obvious on day one. And I think it's important that the president not just listen to the drumbeat of Republicans before he makes decisions like that.
And one other thing, we haven't, the three of us haven't had a chance to talk about the political implications of the assassination attempt. At first, when I saw the attempt and that iconic image and so forth, I thought, wow, this is going to, my initial reaction was a strong emotional reaction. But then when I sort of had a chance to pull back, I thought, okay, given how baked in almost everyone's views in the electorate are, I honestly don't see this moving the needle a whole lot either way, although, of course, surviving an assassination attempt in such good and strong form as Trump did probably helps him marginally. But I think my initial reaction was maybe a little overreaction. I know, Trey, you kind of thought that, wow, this initially was going to be a big help for Trump as well. I'm wondering if you've kind of had any second thoughts about that, or I know Ken already thinks that Harris is going to just roll over Trump. But Trey, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I stand by my initial analysis. However, my initial analysis was predicated on the fact that we had Biden as his opponent.
Okay.
Right. And I think it made a powerful image difference, right? You have again, I'm not suggesting that we have to agree with this narrative, but the images paint a narrative of powerful, strong survivor versus old, frail, declining, right? And so I think in that context, I think that would have built up additional steam as we went forward, especially assuming, if I was correct, that we had another poor debate performance from Biden as we moved into September. I don't back away from that analysis. What I do suggest, though, is that it is not the same analysis as when you now have Harris running. So, we have to shift things, but I don't think the analysis was inaccurate. I think now we just have a different candidate and therefore a different set of images and a different, therefore, media frame that we'll have to take into account. And I don't know yet. It would be ill-advised of me to attempt to say, well, this is how that kind of media frame will play out, given that we just now are learning of Harris and what that's going to look like. So I stand by my thought on that, my interpretation of that, but that doesn't hold in the same way as a predictive tool, since we have a different candidate facing Trump now.
That makes sense. Ken, your thoughts on the political implications?
Well, I think the substitution of Harris for Biden is a much bigger political event than the assassination attempt on Trump. The assassination attempt did happen a day or two before the Republican convention, and he did get, even with all that, even with both the convention bounce and the assassination, he had a small bump, but it wasn't even as high as a typical convention bump for other candidates has been in the past, and it's already been completely eradicated since Harris entered the race.
Well, my only thought on that is I wish I would have had the gauze concession in Milwaukee at that convention because all the people wearing those on their ear was something. But anyway, we will end on that note. Thanks, everyone, so much for listening. We really do appreciate it. And hey, if you want to get in touch with us, you think we were right or wrong about something, or you just have a question about something we said, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's good old-fashioned email. We're at mail@politicsguys.com. There's Facebook. There's X. We always put links in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forum for supporters, which is always a fun and interesting place. I'm on it all the time, that's for sure. And if you are not already a supporter and don't have access to that Discord, we hope you will consider becoming one because that's just one of the many benefits you get. You get ad-free versions of everything we release. You get the full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview. So a lot of good stuff. And as always, I will make sure I put the link in the show notes to that. And if you would like that full midweek show, but you're not in the position to financially support us right now, just send me an email on mike@politicsguys.com and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really helps us out if you subscribe to the podcast and rate and review us on your podcast app, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producing team, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,